They were called daughters, but in truth they were something else. Born from a bloodline twisted back upon itself, hidden deep in the folds of the Ozark Mountains, their faces told stories long before their voices ever could. Crossed eyes, uneven jaws, fragile limbs that trembled under the weight of survival. These were not accidents of birth. They were the echoes of choices made in secrecy, choices whispered through generations, choices no one was supposed to know about. The Ozarks are more than jagged hills and forgotten towns. They are a place where the soil itself seems to hide shame, where neighbors turn their eyes away, and where families can disappear into their own silence for decades. It is here, buried in rural isolation, that two sisters grew up in a house without boundaries, without outsiders, without escape. They were daughters of fathers who were uncles, mothers who were cousins, a family tree that folded in on itself until it became a cage. But history has a cruel way of leaving traces. Photographs survive, even when families burn the rest. In black and white images that almost look staged, you see their faces staring back at you. Eyes too close together, mouths that do not quite close, expressions that never seem to relax. You can almost hear the silence of their lives pressing in, the hush of secrets carried from cradle to grave. What happened to these daughters is not written in school textbooks. You won't find it in the tourist brochures of Missouri or Arkansas. It survives only in whispered accounts, medical records locked in drawers, and the memories of those who stumbled too close to the truth. And yet, when you follow their story, when you dare to look at what life really meant inside those walls, you realize these girls were not simply victims of circumstance. They were the living proof of what happens when a community decides to look away, when shame becomes stronger than mercy. This is not just a story about inbreeding, it is a story about what isolation does to the human soul, about how a family can become a prison, and how children can inherit the sins no one dares to speak aloud. Tonight, we go into the Ozarks, not the one on postcards, but the one history tried to bury. And in that darkness, we will ask, what really happened to the most inbred daughters of the Ozarks? The Ozarks in the early 20th century were a world apart from the America most people imagined. Dirt roads wound like veins through endless hills, and entire families lived their whole lives without leaving the ridge they were born on. Poverty was not just common, it was expected, and poverty breeds silence. In these small hollows and hidden valleys, families often married within their own kin, not because they dreamed of it, but because the outside world was too far away, too suspicious, too condemning. The daughters we speak of were born into that silence. Their parents, themselves bound by blood too close to deny, passed on more than just their name. They passed on a body that carried the history of every hidden union, every cousin's vow, every brother who became a husband. Doctors, when they did come, would note their features but never speak too loudly of what they saw. Communities knew, of course, you can't hide a face that carries the truth in its bones, but to speak it aloud would mean condemning not just one family, but a way of life. So the daughters lived in the shadow of that pact of silence. Neighbors remembered them as pale figures, often together, rarely apart. They did not join the other children in play, not out of cruelty, but because difference in small towns is dangerous. Every crooked smile, every uneven step was a reminder of a secret no one dared to face. Teachers, if they attended school at all, struggled to teach them. Some say the girls spoke little, their voices soft, their words sometimes slurred, as though their mouths refused to shape the world clearly. Others recall their eyes, wide and haunting, as if they carried an awareness of something they could not speak, a knowledge of the cage they had been born into. Yet what made their story truly terrifying was not simply their appearance, but the way they were trapped by it. Inbred says, like the Ozarks, reputation was survival. Families who carried the stain of inbreeding were often shunned, left to fend for themselves, their bloodline shrinking further inward with each passing generation. For these daughters, the world outside the hills was already closed to them. They had no marriage prospects beyond their own kin, no hope of leaving without exposing the very truth their family had spent years concealing. Their future had already been written before they took their first breath. And so the question grows darker. How long can a family, a bloodline, a community keep such truths buried before the weight of them breaks the children at the center of it? There is a silence that lingers in certain photographs, the kind that seems to echo louder than any scream. The images of these daughters, if you have ever seen them, feel almost staged by history itself. Their gazes do not meet the camera with pride or even fear. Instead, they look slightly away, as though aware that to be seen is dangerous. Their faces bear the unmistakable markers of a family tree that grew too tightly wound, jaws that never quite formed correctly, eyes that drifted off in opposite directions, skin that seemed too pale for the sun-soaked hills around them. But behind every face is a life, and the lives of these girls were not lived in a vacuum. Inside their home, roles blurred in ways outsiders could not comprehend. Fathers who were also uncles, mothers who were also cousins, words meant to describe safety and family became tangled, stripped of meaning. For a child, there was no escape from that confusion. When your blood is both familiar and forbidden, what do you call your parents? And more importantly, what do you call yourself? Neighbors rarely spoke of what they saw, but whispers survived. The daughters were often described as distant, quiet, almost spectral in their presence. When others played in the fields, they lingered at the edges. When church bells rang, they appeared only sometimes, seated in the back, eyes cast down. It was as if the family itself had decided invisibility was safer than scrutiny. Yet invisibility is its own form of violence. It leaves children with no one to notice their suffering, no one to intervene, no one to say that what is happening is not normal. Medical notes from rural physicians confirm what the whispers could not. The daughters suffered from congenital problems, brittle bones, respiratory troubles, difficulty learning even the simplest lessons. One record, long buried in a county archive, mentions a failure to thrive. A phrase that says everything and nothing at once. They were surviving, yes, but barely. The body itself had become a battlefield where the sins of the past fought to write themselves into flesh. And here lies the heart of the horror. These daughters never had the luxury of choice. They were not the ones who made the decisions that twisted their bloodline into knots. Yet every moment of their existence carried the punishment. And as their fragile bodies grew older, as the stares from neighbors grew sharper, it became clear that the daughters were less people in the eyes of their community, and more reminders of a truth too ugly to acknowledge. The Ozarks have always been a place of survival, but for these daughters, survival came at a terrible cost. They lived in homes where the walls held more than voices. They held secrets. Secrets of who slept where, of who fathered whom, of why some children never spoke and others never lived beyond infancy. These houses, often little more than sagging wood and tin roofs, became shrines to silence. And inside, the daughters carried that silence like a second skin. What outsiders could never fully grasp was the way isolation fed the cycle. A family too poor to leave, too ashamed to seek help, turns inward. Each generation folds in on itself until the very idea of an outsider feels like a threat. And the daughters, born into this spiral, knew no other world. They woke to the same ridges, the same gravel paths, the same kin who doubled as caretakers and captors. To them, the outside world was not a place of opportunity. It was a world that would judge, expose, and condemn. And so, they stayed hidden. But secrecy does not erase suffering. Accounts suggest the daughters endured not only the physical weight of their conditions, but the psychological torment of being unwanted by the very world they longed to know. It is said that their laughter, when it came, was brittle, easily broken. Their smiles rarely reached their eyes. When they spoke, people described the words as soft, sometimes muddled, as though each syllable fought against the weight of their lineage. Some neighbors, recalling them years later, would say they looked older than they were. Childhood seemed to slip from them before it even began. Yet perhaps the most haunting truth was how quickly they vanished from memory. These were not girls who left behind diaries or letters. They did not leave for cities or schools or husbands. Their lives remained bound to the ridges and hollows, and when they disappeared, they disappeared quietly. Some say illness took them young. Others whisper that their bodies simply gave out, too fragile to carry the burden they had been handed. A few suggest something darker, that their story ended not with sickness, but with silence enforced by those who wanted the bloodline's shame to be buried with them. And that is where history becomes its most dangerous, when the line between fact and rumor blurs, and all that remains is a haunting absence. The daughters lived, the daughters suffered, but how they died, that is the question no one in the Ozarks ever dared to answer directly. The tragedy of the Ozark daughters does not rest solely in their birth or their suffering, but in how completely they were abandoned by the world around them. To the community, they were reminders of shame. To their own family, they were proof of sins that could never be confessed, and so they existed in a kind of limbo, alive, but already forgotten. Their photographs, when they surface, carry a chilling quality, not because of what you see, but because of what you know you're not being told. Some families in the region carried reputations that lasted generations. A name alone could mark you as untouchable, unworthy, cursed. For the daughters, that curse was etched into their very features. Imagine walking into a room and knowing that every glance is not at who you are, but at what your bloodline represents. Imagine living each day aware that your body has become evidence of your family's history, evidence you cannot hide. That was the daughter's reality. Every smile, every step, every word, a reminder of secrets they never chose. It is easy, perhaps, for outsiders to look at their story with morbid fascination, to point at the deformities, the strangeness, the whispered tales. But fascination hides a darker truth. These were children first. Children who deserved laughter, friendships, futures. Instead, they inherited a world that denied them all of it. That is what makes their story so unsettling. It is not simply about genetics or poverty, but about what happens when a society decides certain lives are not worth saving. And here is where the past presses hardest against the present. Families like theirs were not unique. Across America's hidden corners, in the Appalachians, in the swamps, in the hollows of the South, stories like this festered in silence. Some survived only as rumors, others as medical oddities, but all carried the same echo. What happens when shame is allowed to govern a people more than compassion? If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed silent, as so many did, or would you have tried to break the cycle, even if it meant carrying the shame into the light? The daughters never got that choice. They were born into silence, lived inside it, and left the world with it. And perhaps that is why their memory unsettles us still, because it forces us to ask whether we would have done any different, or whether we too would have looked away. What makes the story of the Ozark daughters so haunting is not only the tragedy of their lives, but the way their memory was erased almost as soon as it began. In family Bibles, their names are missing. In public records, their details are sparse, reduced to a few lines. Born, lived, died. No marriages, no children, no legacy. As if by stripping them from history, the family could also strip away the shame. But erasure is its own kind of violence. To erase someone is to declare their suffering meaningless, their existence unworthy of remembrance. And yet, fragments remain. A birth certificate folded away in a courthouse drawer, a faded photograph kept in the back of a family album, a memory whispered by an old neighbor who still dares to speak, even when others stay silent. Piece by piece, these fragments tell a story the family wanted buried. They tell of girls who smiled shyly when spoken to, who sometimes played along the edge of fields, who were human in every way, except in how the world treated them. But silence does not last forever. In recent years, genealogists and historians have begun to retrace these forgotten bloodlines. They uncover not only the medical evidence of inbreeding, but the social structures that allowed it to continue unchecked. Poverty, isolation, lack of education, all combined to build a cage around these families, and inside that cage, children were born already doomed to carry the past on their faces. The daughters of the Ozarks were not the first nor the last to bear that fate, but they remain some of the clearest reminders of what happens when communities choose shame over salvation. Even today, their story lingers like a warning, because while we may comfort ourselves with the belief that such horrors are relics of the past, the truth is far more unsettling. Isolation still exists, silence still rules in places where poverty and pride intersect. Families still carry secrets too heavy to face, and somewhere, even now, there may be children growing up in the same kind of darkness, hidden away, erased before they ever have a chance to be seen. The daughters of the Ozarks are gone, but the questions their lives left behind are not. How far will a family go to protect its secrets? How long can a community look away before silence itself becomes a form of complicity? And what happens when the children born of that silence grow old enough to realize the truth? In the end, the story of the most inbred daughters of the Ozarks is not just about them. It is about all of us, about what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. These girls, pale shadows moving along the ridges of Missouri and Arkansas, were not born monsters, they were born children. They laughed, they wept, they carried the same fragile hopes every child carries, but their blood carried a history they did not choose, and the world around them refused to offer mercy. Perhaps the most chilling part of their story is how ordinary it was for those who lived around them. Neighbors saw, doctors knew, teachers suspected, yet silence won. It always wins in places where shame is stronger than compassion. And so the daughters were left to vanish into the hills, their lives whispered about only when someone was brave enough to speak the truth. In that silence, a pattern repeats, secrets passed down, suffering inherited, and history buried until only a photograph remains. But photographs do not lie. When you look into their eyes, you see more than deformity. You see the weight of generations pressing down, the quiet resignation of children who never had a chance. You see a truth the family could not erase, that suffering leaves marks too deep for silence to cover. So what really happened to the most inbred daughters of the Ozarks? The answer is as unsettling as it is simple. They lived short lives defined by secrets they did not create. They suffered the consequences of choices made long before they were born, and then, like shadows at dusk, they disappeared, swallowed by a world that never truly saw them, except as reminders of what it feared most. Their story lingers not because it is rare, but because it is part of a hidden history America does not want to face, a history of forgotten families, of children sacrificed to silence, of lives erased so the reeds could move on unburdened. And now, as their images resurface, as their names are whispered again, we are forced to ask the question their community never did. What do we owe to the ones history tried to erase? The daughters are gone, but their silence still speaks. It speaks in the photographs, in the empty lines of family records, in the echoes of a community that chose shame over salvation. And if you listen closely, in the dark hills of the Ozarks, you can almost still hear them, voices never allowed to be fully alive, asking us not to forget.